You cannot continually increase taxes forever and not face serious repercussions. The Canadian brewing industry needs continuing reinvestment to stay globally competitive. We're going to probably talk about innovation and new things coming down the pipe, but everything from the way you ferment, store, distribute beer is always evolving and changing, meaning that you always have to invest back into your business. And if governments take all the cream off the top every year, that money will not be there to reinvest. And then slowly but surely, there's a decline in the capacity of brewing in Canada, which would be a shame given our heritage and the rich tradition of brewing in Canada, and impacting not just beer consumers, but bartenders, servers, and obviously farmers who grow all the stuff that we need to make beer. So huge repercussions if we don't put a break on ever increasing taxes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to what will be the final episode of the season for the Grain Growers of Canada podcast, Beers with Branden. I'm your host, Branden Leslie. This summer series podcast is brought to you by our presenting sponsor, Beer Canada. Beer Canada is the voice of the people who make our nation's beers, and their members account for 90% of the beer produced in Canada. The sale of beer supports 149,000 Canadian jobs, generates $14 billion in gross domestic product, and $5.7 billion in government tax revenues. Beer Canada has represented Canadian brewers since 1943. Today's guest is here to talk to us a bit more specifically about Canada's beer industry. CJ Hélie was appointed president of Beer Canada in June 2021. CJ has over 25 years of experience in the Canadian beverage alcohol industry with intimate knowledge of the sector at the provincial, territorial, national, and international levels. CJ is a seasoned government relations specialist with a strong track record in effective strategic and business planning, domestic and international trade, and corporate communications. CJ has forged valued working relationships with liquor regulators, legislators, and policymakers, as well as the related industries to build long-term partnerships and to find collaborative solutions to emerging issues. CJ, thanks so much for joining me here today to close out this season of Beers with Branden.
Branden, thank you very much. Very much looking forward to chatting.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive right in. You're looking good. I like the Beer Canada rep. This is a perfect way to close off this summer series. So maybe I'll start with you, CJ. I know I just mentioned you had 25 years in the industry, but tell us a bit about your background and how you ended up in the beverage alcohol industry.
Well, I was very fortunate. I started off in the beer industry working part-time for the beer store to fund my undergraduate studies. So I got to know the beer industry from the ground up, working mostly in the retail stores, but also had a few shifts in the warehouse and on trucks, delivering to restaurants, all that kind of stuff. So it really grabbed my attention as a great industry to work in. But I left the industry, left the province to do some graduate work studies. And when I graduated with an MBA, I came back and started in management at the beer store. Started off in the operations division, so the division that looked after the stores and the warehouses and the trucks and all of that. But then after a couple of years, moved over to the finance division and ended up a corporate controller. So looking after the money side, which was very interesting on beer because he got into all the taxation issues and all of those things. Very eye-opening in terms of how much tax beer was really subject to. And then in the early 90s, some of your listeners might be aware, there were a number of international trade fights between Canada and our major trading partners, the US and the EU in particular, about preferential treatment, or what they viewed as preferential treatment for domestic alcohol producers. So there was a WTO case that looked specifically at imported beers access to the Ontario market. And since I had a fair bit of experience across lots of the business functions in the beer industry, I was hired by the Brewers of Ontario to craft a industry response to those trade fights. So all in all, I was about 12 or 13 years with the beer industry in various functions and loved it, but ended up leaving the beer industry to join the Canadian spirits industry. And I worked there for a number of years in mostly government relations. And then, as you say, just in June of this year, I came back to the fold as the president of a newly structured Beer Canada.
Well, maybe I know we're going to get into some taxation stuff. I want to pause on that part and come back to it. But when you say restructured, what is Beer Canada now? What does it do? Where's it going?
So Beer Canada is the national trade association representing Canadian brewers. It's the only national inclusive trade association, meaning that anybody who brews beer in Canada can be a member. And recently, Beer Canada was restructured to also expand its mandate from solely looking at the federal government and international relations to provincial and municipal advocacy as well. So now we are involved in all aspects of beer regulation within Canada, outside of Canada, anything that could impact the Canadian beer industry or Canadian brewers, we have our hand in now. Our membership is very broad, probably 45 to 50 members at the moment, ranging from a small brew pub someplace to regional brewers to the Canadian subsidiaries of large multinational companies. So we have a chance to represent sort of the big, broad perspective of what all that is brewing in Canada. And we are an advocacy group primarily, which means that we identify areas of the operating environment that impacts either the brewer or the beer consumer, and how can we improve the situation for them. And we identify those needs, find out a solution that a government or regulator might buy into, and then sell them on that to improve the lot of Canadian beer consumers and Canadian brewers.
We got a lot of work ahead of you. So was there an impetus when you said that you expanded into the provincial realm? Was there an increase in regulation across some provinces that kind of drove that, or why the need to expand into these areas of advocacy?
Traditionally, Canadian national trade associations looked at the federal government as the entity that they would spend most of their time on. Beer is one of those industries that is primarily regulated at the domestic, at the provincial level. And historically, the Canadian beer industry sort of approached that in a very piecemeal fashion. They would have a representative group in this province or in that region, figure out what might work best in the short term to respond to a new provincial government, but there was no real national strategy. So the new structure brings a national vision to the Canadian beer industry at the provincial level, and hopefully builds on synergies, learnings from one jurisdiction to the other, be able to move resources from one region to another, depending on election cycles and so forth. So I think it was just a recognition that the world is changing. Government relations has to change along the way as well. And let's put forward our best foot forward in every aspect of the business and in the regulatory framework. So don't leave any stone unturned for advantages that we can find for beer consumers.
Well, and maybe that's the point that I'll dive into the taxation side of thing here, and maybe you, I think, hopefully have some of the stats at the ready on what percentages of beer is taxed. As my understanding, it is extremely high, but I guess perhaps more importantly is that it's only going to get worse. The government a few years ago, I believe, implemented something called an escalator tax, which basically just increases taxes on beer and alcohol every year in perpetuity forever. Obviously, as a consumer, I think that irks me. I don't think it was something that any brewer of any size would appreciate, with the potential of limiting your consumption patterns of consumers. So why is this tax a problem both for the sector and for the average beer drinker like me?
So the biggest problem is, it was the point you raised earlier, and how much tax are beer consumers paying in Canada already? And they'll be shocked to hear that it's almost 50%. I think the last calculation we did, it was 47 point something percent of the average retail price that you're paying are taxes. So you start off with the premise that taxes are already too high. So why would you put in an automatic increase every year? And right now, there's not a minister of finance in the country who could bring forward legislation, given everything that's going on with the economy, with the COVID business recovery, with the consumer really feeling pinched all over the place, a tax increase, right? There's just no way that would pass any legislature or parliament. But a few years ago, the federal government introduced this automatic increase annually to beer taxes, what we call the excise duty, so the federal tax, regardless of the circumstances facing either the brewing industry or the consumer. So we have just gone through, a once in 100-year challenge in terms of the economy and health of Canadians. And here we are looking at the third consecutive increase in beer taxes federally since the COVID hit the shores. It's just crazy to think that that's happening now. Now, we just had an election. We have a whole set of new MPs. So hopefully they're going to get their heads out of the sand, take a new look at this and say, enough is enough. We will repeal this automatic escalator, and we will not be increasing beer taxes on consumers on April 1st. Lots of work to do to educate these new MPs about the challenge of these taxes on Canadian businesses. But I think they're all want to do the right thing. They were all out there on the hustings requesting our votes. We voted for them. So let's hope they listen to us now.
Well, that's always a target, not always the easiest thing. So what happens if it doesn't work? Does this just continually get more and more expensive, and in turn, breweries, some of them just aren't going to make it because there's not enough demand? I don't want to be too alarmist here, but that seems like the inevitable outcome.
You cannot continually increase taxes forever and not face serious repercussions. The Canadian brewing industry needs continuing reinvestment to stay globally competitive. We're going to probably talk about innovation and new things coming down the pipe, but everything from the way you ferment, store, distribute beer is always evolving and changing, meaning that you always have to invest back into your business. And if governments take all the cream off the top every year, that money will not be there to reinvest. And then slowly but surely, there's a decline in the capacity of brewing in Canada, which would be a shame given our heritage and the rich tradition of brewing in Canada, and impacting not just beer consumers, but bartenders, servers, and obviously farmers who grow all the stuff that we need to make beer. So huge repercussions if we don't put a break on ever increasing taxes. And the feds are not the only governments in Canada that impose taxes on beer, obviously. In Ontario, there's also a version of this automatic increase, but to their credit, Premier Ford, through COVID, put a freeze on it, said, listen, I know I have that in my legislation, but this is not the right time to raise taxes on Ontarian beer consumers. So we're going to freeze it through the end of COVID. So we're hoping that that enlightened view will transform itself into similar decisions at Queen's Park in this spring, and in Ottawa when they do their budget as well.
Excellent. Well, as an Ontario resident, thanks for getting us a pause. Let's hope that will prevail in the longer term here. But you mentioned some of the, I'd say, the secondary impacts on the economy, the bartenders, like people, you might not necessarily think of it, but there's a lot of jobs associated with the beer industry, perhaps indirectly. What is that economic impact, and what's been the progression and trend of it? And aside from the taxation, could we expect that to continue being a major contributor to the economy?
So brewers are primary manufacturers, right? It's an old school business, meaning that we buy very relatively modest grains. We make a mash out of it, convert it into alcohol, then add a whole bunch of added value by making it a consumer product, a high value consumer product that is then marketed, promoted, distributed across the country and internationally. So the job impact is really throughout the economy. So you have obviously the farmer, you have the machinery manufacturer who supplied the farmer with the equipment necessary to grow the barley, the rye, the wheat, all of that kind of stuff. The service technician who goes out to the farm to fix the tractor when harvest time is there and the tractor is broken down. Somebody has to be there that morning to fix it. We have truckers, warehousers, bartenders. So directly employed in the beer industry is about 20,000 people, but the impact of beer jobs in Canada is closer to 150,000 people. And those are families dependent on beer production for their survival and sustenance. So a huge impact. And as you mentioned earlier, I think the economists would say that's $15 billion worth of GDP added to the Canadian economy, a huge number.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'll continue to do my part. I can promise you that. Can you maybe just touch on that relationship between the brewing community, the malting community, and the farming community? How does this actually function, and why does it work so well, and where is it going? And I guess this relates to the burgeoning craft brewery industry. It seems like there's more direct connections than ever before here too. So just want to speak a little bit about that relationship or those relationships.
I have never talked to a master brewer who didn't say, I can't make good beer without great grains, right? So that's the start of everything for us. And we do have long-standing relationships, or some of our brewers have long-standing relationships with family farms and so on and so forth. Barley is the sort of the backbone of beer in Canada, but other grains are used to a large extent as well. Primarily, I'd say rye, wheat, a little bit of corn. And some of the newer grains, like with all the innovation that's going on, people are trying everything, get new taste profiles, differentiation in the market, all those kinds of things. So there are, I think, 24,000 barley farmers alone who are selling to brewers across Canada. So it's a relationship that is so important to us. And in Canada, we are so lucky to have the abundance of super premium grains that are available for brewers. The impact of that grain and sort of the quality of it gives us a huge advantage over many of our international competitors. As you know, we export a lot of bulk grains around the world, and lots of that is bought by brewers around the world because Canada makes some of the best grains in the world for brewing.
Well, you're darn right, and I appreciate that sentiment and that knowledge, and it's very true. We are in an envious position. People want our product, and thankfully Canadians get to enjoy that too. What is the general trend for beer consumption in Canada? Now, perhaps early in the pandemic, it ramped up for some people, I would suggest, but perhaps in the lead up to or during COVID, what are we seeing as far as consumption trends?
So unfortunately, COVID was not the bump in beer consumption that many in the media have reported. So what happened in the last 18, 20 months is that with the closure of all the hospitality venues, your local pub was closed. And beer is being sort of the most social of all the drinks, right? Getting together with your friends, going out to the pub, having a drink after work, and as well, no professional hockey games, no professional basketball games, no professional soccer games. All those events that are sort of hugely dominated by beer all evaporated. Even your backyard barbecue, right? You didn't have your family over or your neighbors over for your July 1st barbecue. How much beer wasn't consumed because of those events that didn't happen? So we were the only beverage alcohol category in Canada that saw a volume decline in 2020. It was driven primarily by the on-premise, but these other social events that didn't happen. So just to give you a few numbers, I think draft beer, which, as you know, is almost exclusively sold on-premise, was down 60% in 2020. Like, it just evaporated overnight.
Yep.
We converted some of that, or our brewers converted some of that to hand disinfectant, but lots of it was just waste, right? You made the product, it has a life shelf, and it was gone. So yes, home consumer increased a bit, how much people were drinking at home because they were there all day and whatever. But overall, the volume decline was in the, let's say, 2 to 3% range in 2020. And we have continued that negative trend 6 months into 2021. So we're hoping with the reopening, bringing arenas to full capacity, people feeling more comfortable inviting their neighbors and their family for gatherings, that we're going to see a significant rebound in the second half of 2021 and into 2022, but we don't know yet. So what we see is a very fragile recovery. So we're in close contact with restaurant partners and even on the retail side, and everybody is hoping that the worst is behind us and that we're going to get back to normal soon. But you never know. We've thought that in the past, and we've taken one step forward and two steps back kind of thing. So it's a very fragile recovery. Restaurants and bars are facing, higher debt loads than they've ever carried because of what happened over the last 18 months. And so it's going to be a tough sledding for that sector. Tourism is still nowhere near where it was. And again, beer at as part of that visit, whether it's interprovincial, in-province, or international, is a huge part of our business as well. And restaurants and bars are facing increased costs, right? Labor costs. You read that in the headlines all the time. There's lots of pressure on that sector. And if there are 10%, 20%, 30% fewer bars and restaurants a year from now than there were before COVID, that's going to impact brewers for sure.
Absolutely. Well, anecdotally, I mean, here in Ottawa anyways, that it's great to see how people are over lunches downtown and stuff. And, they're not quite full all the time yet, but we're going that way. The lines at the Red Blacks game and the Senators game I was at this last week and a half here or so, they're getting longer. So I mean, there is a good news, but I certainly understand that fragile probably being the correct word here. And we certainly hope to see under 10% and not have a significant demise of a number of bars and restaurants there. So you mentioned you had experience with the beer store, so you're very familiar, and it'll range by province of how beer and liquor is sold. Most people, I would say, don't love it in whatever province they're in, just for a lack of availability or freedom or whatever angle you want to take. So if you could design a new system, say, don't worry about provinces, we have one country, one system for beer and alcohol sales, would it be different than any of the models we have now, and what would it be?
There are lots of problems with the regulatory framework in Canada for beverage alcohol and beer in particular. We talked a little bit about tax, but I'll give just another example on tax first before talking about distribution and retail. So in Canada, this will shock you, Branden, I'm sure. We continue to impose federal alcohol excise taxes on beer that doesn't have any alcohol. So think about that for a minute. We have non-alcoholic beer, and the federal government still imposes alcohol excise duties on it. So we're the only country in the world that we've identified that does that. No province in Canada does it. And when we talk to the Department of Finance or the Canada Revenue Agency, they go, oh, yeah, well, that's because you are operating under an act that was essentially created 60 years ago. It had no relation to the business environment today. And so deal with it. And we say, no, thank you. Let's change it. Let's make the act more modern and respectful of those consumers who want to drink a non-alcoholic beer every once in a while.
So is there any? I mean, you're right. It doesn't surprise me, but it shocks me at the same time. Is there a trend that you think that's actually going to be something you guys can accomplish? And I say that, I mean, I had one of the sponsors we had in the pod this summer offered a non-alcoholic beverage, one of the first ones I've tried, and it's clearly growing in popularity, whether it be big or smaller craft breweries. These are on offer and they're more readily available in grocery stores and certain jurisdictions. So it seems like a pretty easy selling point. Is there any appetite, or is this just low on the totem pole and means less money in government coffers, so it's not likely to move up anytime soon?
So I'm brand new in the beer industry, right? Or back into the beer industry. So I'm 3 or 4 months in. What I'm telling every MP and every minister's office and everybody who will listen to me, I go, this is the litmus test. If you cannot see yourself to fixing this, what are you doing? This is such an easy thing. There should be a unanimous vote in Parliament to get rid of alcohol taxes on non-alcoholic beer. Like, it should be that simple.
Well, I mean, if it's a sin tax on something that's, we'll call it a lesser sin, I mean, it seems straightforward to me. So I wish you luck and capturing their attention, because I think you have a pretty strong selling point there. Were there any other? You mentioned the distribution aspect of the challenges. What are those?
So through the COVID, I think we have experienced a acceleration of change in how consumers want to buy their products. not just alcohol, but everything. I want to be able to order online from my phone, from my tablet, what I want, when I want, how I want. Canada's e-commerce strategy for alcohol is, I was going to say antiquated. It's worse than that. We don't have one, right? So what we need to do federally, provincially, is figure out a way that collect all the taxes that are due, reasonable levels of taxation, not the current levels, but whatever the tax levels are passed by parliaments and legislators, collect those, make sure the alcohol only gets into the hands of people who are of age in that province and are not intoxicated, right? And those are all easy to do, given that we have models from around the world who do this every day. So one of the things that has to happen is bricks and mortar will always be a huge part of beer selling, because people want that interaction. They want to see what's new. They want to talk to the beer retail expert, a little bit of story behind the brand, all those kinds of things. But there's also lots of times where somebody doesn't want to get into a car or get on transit to go to a bricks and mortar store, and they want to order it on a click and collect basis. So I think that's a little bit of a project that we're undertaking in Beer Canada to see how we can facilitate those discussions with regulators across Canada.
So does that challenge largely stem from our interprovincial trade barriers, and that doesn't seem to be closer to resolution through any court cases of late? Is that really the stumbling block? And because this is a bigger challenge, I mean, to some extent the grain industry, but a lot of industries across Canada, I mean, the packaging requirements in different provinces, like there's an immense amount of challenges with our own interprovincial trade here. Is that really what drives this particular problem for this sector?
It is going to be the bigger challenge, but we're not even there within each province yet, right? A brewer in every province is not necessarily allowed to interact directly with the consumer and be able to ship directly. So even within the province, now there are some provinces that allow it and some don't, and there's rules and who can and who can't. But the bigger challenge, of course, will be, okay, we've fixed it for an Ontario resident buying it from an Ontario brewer, but can that Ontario resident also buy it from a Alberta brewer and vice versa? And that's where you get into a little bit of a dogfight between provinces. And it's time that we take a national view for brewing. Canada is a relatively small country, right? It's a very small market relative to the world. And if you start balkanizing it further, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces, you end up having huge inefficiencies across the industry, making us uncompetitive or less competitive than we should be versus brewers in other jurisdictions around the world.
What are your thoughts on ideas that have been floated across by various parties in various provinces regarding public drinking laws? And as I understand, like the European models, I've never been to Europe, but you hear these stories of people they go have a bottle of wine or whatever in the park and the picnic, and it sounds lovely. And there's obviously concerns that that'll just lead to public drunkenness. So I think there's probably fair criticisms, but is that something that Canada should look to adopt for our short summer season, that we could actually go and enjoy a picnic in the park? Or is that something that's kind of on your radar or any government's radar at this point?
It was not on anybody's radar 18 months ago. It jumped way up to the top 5 through COVID. So we were active at the municipal level, because most of these rules end up being driven at the municipal level. And we had all these circumstances where people, particularly living in downtown urban areas, Vancouver, Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, and they didn't have their own private spaces, right? They're living in condo buildings, high rises, all those kinds of things. And there was no place for them to enjoy the summer afternoon with a picnic basket and a local beer. So a lot of municipalities introduced pilot projects to allow public consumption of alcohol in designated spaces. And so some of that was attached to licensed places, so bars and restaurants who were allowed to extend their patios into public spaces. But what we're talking about here is where they identified public parks, beaches, those kind of places, and they had designated areas where you could drink. And lo and behold, the reports are starting to come in from the pilot projects. No increase in drunkenness, no increase in drunk driving, all done very responsibly. And so I just saw West Van identified their pilot projects as hugely successful. They have now made it permanent in the existing park. I think it was Muirhead Park. I could be wrong on the name, but a great little add-on to the report was, and we should look at adding a whole bunch of other parks for next year. So we are making progress on that.
I'm not surprised that the world did not fall apart. This in no way surprising me. People are responsible for the most part, and it's not surprising that that didn't lead to anything terribly problematic. But kudos to those municipalities that had the courage to, frankly, be responsive to the needs of their citizens. I wouldn't envy being stuck in a downtown Toronto condo or whatever city without no option to see your friends or invite them over. It's unfortunate that we had to go through all of this for this small little change to happen, but perhaps an important step in the right direction.
I think the COVID did generate a whole bunch of new thinking processes from regulators, just saying, I know this would have taken us 5 years worth of study to look at previously. We don't have 5 years. We have an emergency here. What can be done to help people get through this, these very time-limited circumstances? And lo and behold, they did a whole bunch of liberalization initiatives that have been proven hugely successful and well received by consumers. And now people are saying, maybe it's a new model for how you do alcohol regulation in the future. Like, let's take a look around, see what works elsewhere, and there's no reason why we shouldn't try it here in Canada.
Absolutely. We do it with other policy initiative or area of policy. Why would this be excluded from that? So, well, that's a good start. And I guess maybe reason enough for a celebration. You guys just celebrated Canada Beer Day on October 6th of this year. So you wouldn't have been on the job too long. I'm sure things were in motion when you joined, but I'm sure you pushed them across the finish line. I had a little personal celebration that evening myself with a couple of friends there. So tell us a bit about Canada Beer Day, what it means, what folks do, and where it's going to go as we get back to normal here too.
You're right. I can't take any credit for any of the success of this year's Canadian Beer Day, because it was a full year in the planning and development and execution stage. So huge kudos to Beer Canada staff who put that on. So Canadian Beer Day is really an opportunity for Canadians from coast to coast, communities across the country, to celebrate Canadian beer, the impact and effect brewing has in their local communities, jobs, social welfare, well-being, all those kinds of things, and share sort of that pride in Canada about how we do beer, right? And it was hugely successful in terms of the number of people, restaurants, partners, all of those who joined in the campaign. So that was great, but it's only a start, right? What we need to do really is elevate it to the next level, where it's not only a Beer Canada Canadian Beer Day, but it's a national Canadian Beer Day. So we're asking parliamentarians to recognize the Wednesday before Thanksgiving each year as Canadian Beer Day. It's something that the US does with bourbon. So September is National Bourbon Heritage Month. I'm not sure if that's the exact word, but something like that. Canada has a richer tradition in beer than the US ever has had in bourbon. So let's make the Wednesday before Thanksgiving each year an official Canadian day of recognition for Canadian beer and Canadian brewers. So we are working towards that, and we're going to have, hopefully, likely, in-person events next year that weren't able to be done this year. We had a huge take up on Canadian embassies and missions overseas, celebrating Canadian Beer Day around the world, in Tokyo and in Brussels and in DC. So I think there's a huge opportunity there to get Canadians diplomats more educated on the value of what beer really means. And beer is a hugely opportunistic calling card for diplomats. Everybody around the world knows we make great beer here, right? And so raising the Canadian flag a little bit around Canadian beer, I think is a natural fit.
I love that. And I think it's worthy of a day. And actually, this reminds me, one of our guests we had on the pod, I believe it was Cam Dahl. This conversation came up that we should have a day. And he had a pretty good suggestion that actually should probably just be all of October, or pick any month that you so choose. So just leave that with you. If you want to elevate that to a full month, I think everybody will be okay, because it's worthy of celebration there.
I love it.
Now, you mentioned the American bourbon situation. Now, there's a lot of rumors out there that Canadian beer is, I would say, better. I think we can all agree on that, but it's stronger. And anecdotally, I don't know if that's true. Is it true? Is Canadian beer actually stronger?
I would call that a trick question, Branden. And why is it a trick question? It's because beer today is not what beer was. So today, what differentiates and is the calling card for beer is its diversity. All the different types, kinds, flavors of beer. So there's 1% alcohol beers, there's 4% alcohol beers, and there's 9% alcohol beers, right? So there's the full gamut. If you want a low alcohol beer, there's a Canadian beer that fits you perfectly. If you want a high strength Canadian beer, there's one that fits you perfectly. So on the alcohol content, which is one definition of strong, right? I'd say Canadian beer, we have everything you might want, whether from a very light alcohol beer to a high alcohol beer. But also when you talk about, is Canadian beer stronger or not than some other beer, you're often also talking about flavor profile, right? Does it taste stronger? Does it have more flavor? And again, it all depends what you want. There's such much choice in the Canadian market today. You can have a very light tasting, refreshing summer lager, but you can have a very heavy malt or stout as well, or a fruit flavor beer. So again, I'd say it's a trick question because there's the huge range of strength of beers, both in terms of flavor and alcohol content.
And we're lucky to have that. And maybe I'll get you to speak a little bit to this craft beer movement, explosion, whatever you want to call it, but there's a big increase that we're seeing. And I think it's fantastic. And for the reasons you just outlined, that we have this diversity of flavors and contents and whatever you want, whatever you could think of at this point is there. And my assumption is that's going to continue. Is that the view of Beer Canada, that craft breweries are going to keep popping up and they're doing well, and that's great to see?
Absolutely. Now, the one caveat, of course, is everybody has their own definition of what a craft beer is, which is good.
What is a craft beer then?
It depends on who's defining it, right?
What does CJ say?
What does CJ say? I say every beer that is made with attention to the detail is a craft beer. So it's products made from Canadian grains that is done with a master brewer making sure that the product is perfect before it's put into a bottle or a can. Now, when we talk about craft beer, what we often talking about is the local brewer, right? The brewer in my neighborhood.
Right.
And I think that absolutely has a huge amount of appeal to Canadians. I would say 20 years ago, if you talked about a craft brewer, you were talking about a brewer in your province.
Right.
10 years ago, you were talking about a brewer in your city. Today, you're talking about a brewer in your little, French, quartier, your little neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And you know the brewer, you know the family who invested their family savings in starting this new entrepreneurial business because it's a passion of theirs. And so with that passion, I think, yes, we will continue to see this growth in small, local, entrepreneurial brewers in Canada. And yes, absolutely a great thing for the beer industry and beer consumers.
Love it. So I was recently diagnosed with something that I had to Google up after, which was Cenocellicophobia, I bet it's more of a common phobia out there that folks might not be aware that they have. Can you tell us what that is and what the solution to it may be?
So it is a common phobia, but there is an easy solution to it. So the definition, not the WebMD definition, but CJ's definition, I guess we'll go along that path, is a fear of an empty glass of beer, where you start seeing that last drop in your beer glass disappear, and you start have this anxiety attack about whether and when you're going to have your next beer. So the easy solution, and there's two approaches you should have, and so I would say take notes, Branden. One is make sure your fridge is always well stocked, because you have to account for not just your own consumption, but your friends' consumption, and if your kids are of a certain age, your kids' consumption. So you have to have more than you think you need to make sure you have just enough.
Yep.
And then the other thing is become friends with your local pub owner. They need your visits more often than ever. So that pint is always no more than a few walks away.
Those are great suggestions. I'm on a good path for both of them. They're good. They're good advice for everybody out there, because as we get back to home, folks dropping by, it's always important to have a beer fridge stocked full of beer. So, this is I would say an innovative industry, much like the agricultural industry. We adopt a lot of new tech and innovations, and I suspect that that's certainly something with all size breweries that are being adopted. What can we expect over the next decade or so from whether it be product perspective, environmental footprint, packaging, or anything else? I don't know, is there a hangover cure coming in the not too distant future? What's coming down the pipe for the beer industry here?
Well, I am always amazed at the amount of investment and innovation that goes on the family farm today. Like, it's amazing, the equipment and the sophistication of that equipment on farms in Canada. And we could do as well to be as forward thinking as Canadian farmers are. So kudos to Canadian farmers who are really ahead of the curve there. So in terms of the beer industry, yes, is the answer to almost all those areas, right? So you have on the product side, for sure, an explosion of flavors. You've started to see it, but we've only sort of tipped the iceberg there. So flavors, keep an eye out for innovative flavors that go well with cereal grains. We talked about a little bit about it, but there's going to be an explosion in lower and no alcohol beers. So for those times where you either don't want to or should not be having alcohol, you're going to have a much broader choice of low and no alcohol beers. So on the product side, the innovation is ramping up significantly, both in sort of the R&D side, research and development, but also in the production side, because lots of these new products need slightly different production processes. So lots of investment there. And going back to the tax issue, one of the things that holds back that innovation in Canada is the fact that we don't have the kind of resources that we should have, because government's taking too much off the top. So we have that. On the environmental side, we have made a commitment as an industry to eliminate six-pack ring carriers, plastic six-pack ring carriers. Again, that's going to be a huge investment by the industry. And the question is going to how can we fund that if government doesn't allow us to keep a little bit more money at the end of each transaction. And then we have sort of the whole greenhouse gas emissions issue, where beer is a heavy product, relatively speaking. It needs to be transported across the country into tens of thousands of bars and restaurants and thousands of retailers. So lots of innovation going on there in terms of what is the most environmentally friendly way to distribute beer, both from the full good side, the delivery side, but we are at the forefront of extended producer responsibility. We've had the refillable bottle forever. So not only are we delivering full goods in, we're taking our containers and packaging back into our systems as well. So again, no cost to municipalities or the taxpayer, all funded internally by the brewing industry. And so again, but as the world changes, both in terms of the retail footprint and other things, we have to look at how we make that system more efficient.
Absolutely. That's it in no way surprises me. And we're all facing things. You talk about packaging and the holding containers, that it's something that consumers are asking for. And I've noticed a change in some of the 6-pack. They're green now. I assume that, I think they say biodegradable on them. So it's hitting beer stands now. I'm seeing it as a computer, but I really appreciate you coming on here today, CJ. And maybe I'll give you the last word if you have any comments for all the farm families might be out there listening today.
Well, number one is thank you. We couldn't do what we do without you guys. So keep up the good work. We are facing some difficult circumstances in terms of barley harvest because of the drought out west. And so we need to work more closely than ever together to find a way to make sure that both the family farm and the local brewer can prosper into the future, because these are both great legacies for future generations. So we're just holders of that legacy, right? We need to make sure that it's there for future generations. So thank you to Canadian farmers. We really appreciate all you do for Canadian beer consumers.
Well, I can guarantee you one thing: despite a poor harvest across much of the country and perhaps some limited supplies and unfortunately a little bit higher prices that might translate, farmers are optimists. They're going to get back. They've worked the land this year. They're going to get back into it next year, and we're all hoping for a bumper crop of barley. And I can also guarantee that it's going to be high quality, and it's going to make sure that we continue to have excellent Canadian beer. So thank you, CJ, so much for joining us and for Beer Canada's support of the podcast over this summer. And most importantly, thanks all of you for listening. Personally, this series has been a tremendous opportunity and frankly, a lot of fun for me. Canadian farmers in the beer industry have had a close relationship for almost as long as we've been a country, and I know that will continue for many more. So stay tuned for a return of the Grain Growers of Canada podcast, Fireside Chats with Erin, in the coming weeks, as she speaks to industry influencers and political leaders about how we can drive Canada's agricultural industry forward together in our post-pandemic recovery. If you want to stay up to date with all things Grain Growers of Canada, please follow us on Twitter @Grain Growers or on Instagram @Canada's Grain Growers. As we return to something close to normal, I hope to share a beer and a laugh with many of you over the winter. But until then, get out there and explore some high quality Canadian grains and Canada's favorite drink, Canadian beer. Take care.